So even though we're well into the summer sale at this point, before we get too far down that rabbit hole and I start going over even more games that are either recommendations or games that I've just picked up so I see even more great deals coming down the pike, I did want to go over the games that I picked up in June before we got too deep into July. So that's what today's video is all about, is a selection of the games that I picked up in June that maybe I should have waited a little bit longer to see if any of these did go on sale, but you know, it's too late now. So anyways, let's just go ahead and jump in with the first one, which is actually a remake, or I think a remaster. Actually, I can't remember now that I think of it, but it's from a game that came out in 2001 on the PlayStation 2 originally, and that is Rez Infinite. Now this is a game that I totally ignored in the PS2 era, but I really shouldn't have because it's something of a classic. And today you can play Rez Infinite, which is the updated version that was released in 2015. In Rez, you'll be playing as a hacker infiltrating a malfunctioning artificial intelligence. Along the way, you'll be tasked with fighting off viruses and security software, making your way through the various layers of the system to a bombastic EDM soundtrack. The controls are pretty straightforward, as it's effectively an on-rail shooter in the vein of Panzer Dragoon, where you'll be scanning each environment looking for targets to lock onto before unleashing attacks to deal with incoming threats and projectiles. You can also accrue bombs to drop if you can find auxiliary pickups throughout each stage, but the real draw here is the presentation, which is just a kaleidoscope of particle effects, mid-90s wireframe polygons, and again, a fantastic techno soundtrack. Conceptually, it's just a really cool title to jump into, and if you ever watched Lawnmower Man or remember that scene in Hackers where they finally start hacking the Gibson flying around in cyberspace, you'll have some idea of what to expect here. Naturally, the soundtrack is killer, and this is the sort of game that reminds me of Pac-Man, where regardless of a game's presentation, if the core gameplay is fun, then it's going to have legs way beyond its original release date. That's not to say the presentation here is bad or anything, it looks great, but it always makes me happy to see games that are literally decades old that you can still pick up and have a great time with, and this is one of those titles. Naturally, as a game with a simpler aesthetic, you don't need to tweak anything to have a great experience on the deck, and honestly there weren't a ton of options to configure on that front that I could see, but yeah, if you're looking for a techno dreamscape to fly around in while you do battle with malware and a failing AI security countermeasures, Rez definitely still holds up. Speaking of games with an emphasis on music, although in a slightly different direction, this next one is one that has popped up in the comments more than a few times, and that would be Cassette Beasts. I suppose at its most basic you could call Cassette Beasts a Pokemon clone, except that rather than catching monsters in a Pokeball, you'll be using a cassette player to literally transform yourself into the beast that you encounter in the wild. This is normally where I do a slightly deeper dive into the basic plot and setup of the game, but honestly I think it's best to go in blind as you start your journey in Harbor Town. True to the formula, you'll encounter a range of NPCs in the environment and be exploring each area from a top-down perspective. And they've really nailed the pixel art look of yesteryear here with a blocky aesthetic that you'd expect, but with some modern environmental effects as well that have been peppered in to make things really pop. I know pixel art games aren't anything new, but it's always appreciated when a developer nails the look of that era so well that it sort of clouds the way those games actually played and look versus how you tend to romanticize it in your head when you're years removed from it. I played the original Pokemon Blue when it first came out, and while I've dabbled in entries here and there, Pokemon pretty much got to a place where there were just so many games, spin-offs, and just a sickening amount of monsters to catch that it all got a little bit overwhelming and made me lose interest in it for the most part. So firing up Cassette Beasts was kind of like a breath of fresh air where I could sort of get back to the roots of the genre, but without all of the overhead of its godfather, and for that reason I suspect I'm going to have a lot of fun with Cassette Beasts. Mechanically it's all really familiar and I had no trouble adjusting to it. I'm not sure how well I like their approach to the battle system just yet, but at least initially it's charming where you can repair your cassette tapes by rewinding them with a pencil, or augment the abilities your beasts have by using stickers that, when not in use, can just hang out in your inventory. All in all, I'm liking what I've seen so far, and considering Pokemon started on the Game Boy, it seems appropriate exploring Cassette Beasts on the deck or Ally, and it performs great on both so far. Next up is a game that I already had for the PS5, but I was pretty excited to see it show up on Humble Choice last month, mostly because I'm a big fan of horror games in the portable format, and that is Ghostwire Tokyo. Now technically I'd already started my journey in Ghostwire Tokyo on the PS5, but again, since it popped up on Humble Choice, I was pumped to try it out on the handheld, if for no other reason to just kind of contrast and compare the deck versus the Ally. Ghostwire Tokyo is an action horror game where you'll be playing as Akito Izuki. After getting into a motorcycle accident while on the way to visit your sister in the hospital, a creepy fog rolls in that turns everyone caught inside it into a spirit. The only reason you make it is because you get possessed by a helpful spirit of sorts, and so kicks off your adventure to find your sister and hopefully undo all the supernatural unpleasantness that's rolled into Tokyo. As horror goes, it's not really a horror game in the conventional sense, and it clearly has a bigger focus on action, but I have to say I'm really enjoying this one. It's not the scariest game, nor is it the best action game I've played in this vein, but I appreciate it for having an unsettling premise, and also the sort of pseudo-linear open world that you see in games like Yakuza or Persona. It feels expansive and fun to explore, but without being overwhelming and throwing in collectibles just for the sake of it. The combat's satisfying enough, and putting the whole thing against the backdrop of a haunted Tokyo was just a whole lot of fun. Now, as far as performance goes, it's passable but not great on the Steam Deck. Don't get me wrong, it struggles on the Ally a bit too, but the deck was really chugging to keep up with it, even after I disabled things like motion blur or screen space reflections to try and even out the frame rate a bit. I mean, it's totally playable to be sure, but it can definitely be immersion breaking when a performance hit does occur. One particularly egregious example I found was in this early game cutscene that dropped down to something like 12 frames per second, which I'm thinking occurred because of the reflection of Akito in the mirror here, because after that scene was over and I was just in control again, the frame rate jumped back up. In all likelihood, I'll probably keep playing this one on the Ally for a smoother experience, but still, if you have the deck, it can handle it. You just might have to do some tweaking to find the right balance of performance to visuals, and you might even consider capping this one at 30 frames per second. Now next up is another spooky game, albeit one in a genre I do not visit often, but it performs just great on the deck, and that is Inscription. I can't remember where I heard about Inscription. It might have been a comment here on the channel, it might have been that it popped up as a recommended game, but I'm sure glad that I gave it a shot. Which is weird because typically I do not go for deck building video games. However, historically I have loved Magic the Gathering throughout my life, usually in ways where I get really into it, and then I just sort of back off of it for a few years. And since I'm currently in one of those non-obsessed periods, firing up Inscription definitely reawakened that love I had for trading card games as a whole. Inscription has very little insight into your situation, and I think it's best to go in as blind as possible, so I won't be going too in-depth about what I've seen so far working through the first boss, because it really would be best to go in unspoiled. The core gameplay will feel familiar if you've ever played a deck building game though. You'll have to make decisions about what resources you want to engage to play creature cards, and your ultimate goal is to reduce your opponent's life to 0 and use everything at your disposal to literally tip the scales in your favor. In between matches you'll move a game piece representing your character down a series of paths that sort of pushes the story along, and sometimes these paths lead to points where you can augment your cards with new abilities to give you an edge from match to match. But beyond the tabletop/deck building combo, there's also a sort of first-person escape room/dungeon crawly element to it. And while I obviously have no idea where the story is going to go just yet, it definitely feels sinister so far. And again, all of it plays great on the Steam Deck, and I would highly recommend playing this either in handheld or with a mouse and keyboard, as using the analog sticks to make card selections is just a little bit clunky. Beyond that, I'd also recommend wearing headphones because the audio is oppressive and detailed and really has a way of drawing you into an unsettling take on the genre, and I just can't wait to spend more time with this one. And finally, this last game that I picked up is one that I already had on the Xbox, both the original Xbox and modern Xbox, but I was really excited to play it in a handheld format, and that is Destroy All Humans. I completely adored this game back on the original Xbox, but it has been years since I actually went back through it, so I really wanted to revisit this remastered version that dropped a couple of years back. Mostly because I still haven't gotten around to Destroy All Humans 2, and I'd like to get reacclimated to the story. Which, the basic premise is that you'll be playing as the gray, not green, alien Crypto-137 after your predecessor Crypto-136 was captured on Earth, and your overarching goal is to help prevent the Furon race from going extinct. Now, if you're a fan of 50s sci-fi, or if you're like me and you grew up watching Mystery Science Theater 3000, where 3 robots on the Satellite of Love would heckle movies that were 50s sci-fi in nature, I think you're gonna like Destroy All Humans. It's just schlocky good fun, and while this remake certainly ups the visuals substantially, a lot of the other design elements feel just a little bit dated. It has a pretty strict mission structure, and while I guess it's technically open world, it's not like GTA open world, but rather just sort of like a pseudo open world where you'll be kind of hopping into and out of different scenarios, and then in between each one of those missions you'll be able to upgrade Crypto's abilities and his ship. It's not especially deep or anything, but there is some sense of progression, and I think the primary draw here is just how well it recreates the vibe of 50s science fiction while tossing in plenty of tongue-in-cheek humor. The voice acting's pretty good, but Crypto undeniably sounds like he's doing his best to do a Jack Nicholson impression. Now when it comes to the deck, by default it puts all of the graphical settings to Ultra, which is playable, but I wouldn't call it ideal since it puts the frame rate closer to 30 than 60. But if you scale things back to the high setting, it runs a lot smoother. Also, speaking of smoothness, I did adjust the camera immediately because it was just way too sensitive for me on the right analog stick. After doing that, it was a whole lot easier to start harvesting humanity's brainstems and chuck cows around with my telekinetic abilities, which was extremely enjoyable. Overall, I would say the whole experience does feel a little bit dated even with a fresh coat of paint, but hey, if you're just looking for a fun, over-the-top, campy B-movie premise, then I think Destroy All Humans definitely still delivers. Alright, so that's it for this one, and I feel like that was a pretty diverse set of pickups. You know, I had a couple of like brand new games to check out, like Inscription and Cassette Beast, which I think I'm gonna have a ton of fun with, but then also kind of like a couple of classic throwbacks in the vein of Res Infinite and Destroy All Humans that I think you would call cult classics. I don't think that's too much of a stretch, but hey, what about you? Did you grab anything particularly awesome in June? If so, I would love to hear about it. As always, thanks so much for hanging out, it means a lot. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye.